everybody. I'm Mark Book, head of content for Digitas, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Carolyn DeWitt, the president and executive director of Rock the Vote. Welcome, and very happy to be here with you since I feel like the last 2 weeks have changed my world twice. And your job has gotten even, I'm sure, more difficult.
Yeah, I don't think we can cover all of it in 30 minutes, but yeah.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the mission and history of Rock the Vote?
Sure. So Rock the Vote was founded in 1990 by music executives in response to the censorship of hip-hop and rap artists. It was unique at the time for two reasons. One, it was born out of the culture space, not out of the political space. And two, there was no national organization talking to young voters, talking on behalf of young voters. Young voters weren't thought of as a voting bloc, right? That's definitely changed. But our mission is we are a nonpartisan nonprofit and dedicated to building the political power of young people through voter registration, education, mobilization, and breaking down barriers to participation through modernizing the process and protecting their right to vote. So what does all that mean, right? First, what are young people? Because that's something that's always a question. Some of you will be happy to know that up until about a decade ago, young people in the political space were considered under 40. Rock the Vote comes from the culture space, so it's never had that definition, so sorry, elder millennials. As there's been more polling and more research done, particularly over the last 10 years, it's really 18 to 29, but there's also segments between 1824, 1829. We focus registration and mobilization on 18 to 29-year-olds, and then education efforts, we actually go down to 16 because we're trying to prepare them to know the importance of voting, know what they need to do so that they're empowered as soon as they turn 18. The reason we focus on young people is because generation after generation, each youth generation is a generation without representation. And what do I mean by that? Since 18-year-olds got the right to vote in 1972, young voters have turned out in elections at 20 to 30 points lower than older voters, which means they're unrepresented. This isn't one generation's problem, this is a systematic problem we have in our country. That disparity is even greater when we're talking about local and midterm elections. So that's why we focus on young people. The research consistently says the reason that they do not turn out at the same rates is that they're new voters. They're going through the process for the first time. Process is very complicated. It's different state to state, and in many states they try and make it harder, and increasingly are trying to make it harder for young people to vote, particularly with the diverse generations that we're seeing.
Yeah. So, as a 41-year-old, not super happy about how you define young people, but it is what it is. So, starting in 1990, how has Rock the Vote evolved, and how has it changed reaching people over the last 34 years, specifically the youth vote?
Yeah, so, back in the good old days, pre-internet, you could put a PSA on MTV, get 90% brand recognition of young people.
You're done.
Right, and the PSA lives for, the content lives for months. So it was great. They were our first corporate partner, and they in kind of the advertising, so it was a write-off, it was a win-win. The PSAs were made basically when they were doing their music videos or on set already. You all know more than most how much the media entertainment landscape has changed, music landscape has changed, right? Political, technology, everything. So we've had to keep innovating, and I think the biggest thing for young people that we've seen is what social media has done, right? It's harder to get their attention. We need more content. We need more engaging content. But also, it's broken down kind of the wall between young people and brands. And I'm using brands very loosely here, right? Celebrities, influencers. And so they're requiring more authenticity. I know that's been a theme here. They're demanding more from the brands, that they have values, that they promote those values. They have more access to information than generations before, and it's more of a conversation, and they're empowered to demand more. Like they have a lot of power in our economy, both as employees and as consumers.
Yep. And so how are you leveraging, at Brand Storytelling, how are you leveraging content storytelling to reach and engage with these youth voters?
So this is where, right, storytelling is really important. I think couple pieces is we have to both have the storytelling, and then we have to have the pieces when they're then inspired to take action, right? So the pieces that a lot of people don't know that Rock the Vote does is in 1999, we created the first, and this is long before my time, so credit to the people who came before me, but they created the first online voter registration tool in 99 before any state had online voter registration. We work with states to improve, this is an area we call civic technology. I'm not under the illusion that anyone understands what that means, but it is helping people through the registration process, helping you check your registration status, helping you request an absentee ballot, right? All the steps. We have an amazing ballot lookup tool that you can see your sample ballot, and then we actually search 30 to 40,000 endorsements. We have researchers that come in for a couple weeks, and you can see who on your ballot is endorsed. So it's very clear who aligns with your values, right? So that is the piece that kind of powers behind everything. And we have hundreds, thousands of, the code for the tech, especially the online voter registration, was open code. It's open source. So if you might see Rock the Vote at the bottom of a lot of the technology like that, but you also might see we have companies both, and we have nonprofits who have used the code to create similar tools. The storytelling takes multiple forms, right? So we do the social media work, we are in classrooms, we have relational organizing, which is just essentially organizing where you're bringing in young people to teach them how to talk to their friends and family about voting, right? And telling them why that's important. But the real power actually comes from brands, from our brand partnerships. We know brands largely create the culture and shift the culture. So several years ago, we created a program called Brands for Democracy, in which we partner with brands to create programs that are either employee-focused or public-facing or both, if they are willing to do that. And that's really where the storytelling magic happens.
Can you share some of those success stories that you've had from a storytelling perspective, specifically with brands?
Yeah, so we have a lot, but most recently I would say, Levi's took an approach that was very international. So they did this beautiful ad that showed the way people vote in different countries, right? And it was this diverse, beautiful piece. And it was multi-generational. We had a partnership with Hulu that used clips from familiar shows and
intellectual
movies.
Property, yep.
Exactly, yep. And then they made montages of either steps to voting or highlighted like the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and they put those out. We had this one was back in 2016, but partnership with Vivo that they were almost like mini docs, like 5 minutes long, and each featured a different artist. So there was one with Vic Mensa, for those who don't know, a musician out of Chicago. And he was arrested during the Black Lives Matter protests. And so police brutality was his issue. So the mini doc wasn't about that. Andre Day talked about the importance of arts education, for example. So a lot of different creative things that people who are more creative than I am came up with.
You've got jeans, you've got streaming platforms, you've got what other types of organizations are you typically partnering with or collaborating with on some of these stories?
So aside from companies and brands, we, as I mentioned, provide not just civic technology, but a lot of resources to other nonprofits. So those in the civic engagement space and those not in the traditional civic engagement space. So maybe they're an arts organization, right? Or maybe they're LGBTQ plus organization. And but we also have a program called Athletes Rock the Vote, in which we partner with player associations, leagues, teams. So we have a big partnership with the WNBPA. They are amazing athletes who have just been at the forefront of basically every social issue, and we've had a long partnership with them. So
yeah, that's a deep breadth of different types of partners and organizations. In terms of how you're measuring the success of these programs, how are you evaluating whether you were engaging youth voters and getting them to turn out for whatever election you're pushing?
Yeah, so the important thing about all of the content that we put out is to have a call to action. And as much as we can be involved in those conversations with the brands to make sure that they have that is really important. Not just the call to action, but then the link, right, that you're including so that it's easy to take that action. So they're interacting with our technology. So the call to action is check your registration, right? Check what's on your ballot, whatever it is. Once we have that data, we match back to the voter file. So, and then we do the analysis. Usually the voter files are all updated about 6 to 8 months after the election, but we're doing that. So to give you an example, and anyone who uses our technology comes into what we call our election minder program, where we have your zip code and we then slice the data in order to tell you very specifically when you have early voting, when your deadlines are. And so anyone who comes through our tools, we are turning them out at 30 to 40 points higher than the national average. So for instance, the youth turnout in 2020, which was high, was 50%. So that's high. 2016, it was 39%, to give you an idea. Our turnout in 2020 was 85%. So it's not rocket science, but we just have to keep pushing. Yeah.
And it takes a lot of partners and brands to do
Yep.
that as well.
Yep.
What are the biggest challenges that you face in terms of reaching specifically the youth demographic vote?
Yeah, I don't think this is unique to young people. They're disillusioned, you know? Everyone's disillusioned, I think, but particularly this generation, and this is, I don't think, going to shock anyone, they're very distrustful of older generations. And it's, you know, understandable too. They feel like older generations have not properly addressed a lot of these issues that are at tipping points: climate change, racism, gun violence, right? And they're the generation that's going to have to face the consequences because they're coming at such a critical intensity right now. So that's a really big issue. I think the reality is, you know, our current system is broken. It could be much worse. I know a lot of you guys travel. You've probably been to places where it's far worse. But it also could be a lot better. And there are things we can do, and it's not insurmountable. But we, you know, there are complex ways to fix the problems that we have. And honestly, this is where I actually have been thinking the last couple of days about, like, how do we leverage storytelling to talk more than just voting and elections, but talk about these bigger issues.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so.
And that's how any other ways that you see sort of storytelling playing a role in this aside from the issues?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm like, do I bring up the thing? I really want to do this like in a democracy format, right? Like help people, because you guys are all creatives, you do this, right, for a living, and tell you what are the issues that we're polarization, right? Talk about ranked choice voting. Talk about these things that we can actually do to help fix our system that people aren't, they don't fully understand. We only talk to them when, 3 months before the election. I think that's my other thing is, like, one of the big challenges, not just with young people, but, you know, I'm up here talking right now because there's an election coming up, right? That is not, I'm not blind to that. And I get it. This is when people start thinking about it, and it's not on the top of everyone's minds all the time. And a lot of people don't, right? You don't want to think about it because it's so awful. But the reality is, to make the biggest impact in the changes, we're going to start to have these conversations much earlier and year-round.
Yeah, I think the idea that now is when it's noisiest too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so can we create evergreen storytelling that talks about some of these challenges on an ongoing basis so people are actually informed before they have to go into
Exactly.
this sort of moment?
Yep.
That's great.
Yep.
Any new projects or initiatives that you all are doing? And I know, again, the world changed twice in 2 weeks for the most part, so you might still be pivoting. But anything that you're excited about that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, we have some campaigns coming out, and here's the trick too, is like, because we're nonpartisan, we really focus on what young people care about, and it's not unique to young people, this isn't rocket science again. It's the issues, right? That's what drives people. And we have some pretty big issues at stake. I would say democracy, for those who are not following this, we are teetering. We have been teetering, and we are teetering. And that is like a very real thing. But we have reproductive rights. We have a bunch of other issues. We have to be very careful about how we talk about them, but they are the issues young people care about. And so we can't ignore that. So if we focus on the issues, we're not focusing on the candidates, right? We're focused on the voters, then we don't have to pivot and how people feel about how things are going right now. We don't have to pivot our campaigns, actually, which is really nice. So, but we are busy.
Yeah, and some of those issues that you mentioned are uncomfortable to talk about, right? And I think some brands who can take a risk and talk about those in the right way and have the guidance of you all, I think it would be, a great thing that would essentially rise all ships. Our agency is also working with you, which is great, but for some of the brands and other partners in the room, what is the best way to reach you, to get involved, to help, to partner like some of the other brands and partners that you had mentioned previously? Yeah,
so I'm here. Find me. But also LinkedIn, the app, the brand storytelling app, but also my email is real simple. It's carolyn@rockthevote.org. So would love to talk to anyone who wants to be helpful, whether it's lending your creative time and talents, whether it's brand relationships, whatever it is.
And now is great, but later is great too, right? We were talking about, how do we get past this election? How do we get people involved so that we're not, the midterms aren't right around the corner, and then we're educating people and telling stories, but we have time to do that.
Yeah, I'm already thinking about what are we doing next year, but I'm like very focused on, we have 104 days, people. This is where we are, and early voting starts sooner than that.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I think we'll take questions, but just wanted to say again, thank you so much. I know that there's so much going on, so the fact that you're here is amazing, so thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Sure.
So, we probably don't have the data to support it, but I'm curious with the two incidents, the attempted assassination and Biden not seeking re-election, do those two instances drive younger voters to vote, or does that keep them away? I mean, is it too early to tell? I mean, it's history right now. I mean, this is pretty crazy. I'm curious your opinion on, as a younger voter, do they say, yeah, no, the older people have really effed it up, I'm staying the hell away from the voter box, or does that motivate them to take action?
Yeah, there's no data that I know of. Unfortunately, we oftentimes have to fight and say, you're doing a poll, I want to see what the younger generation looks like in this poll, because I imagine that it's actually very different than older. I think that some things are not shocking to the Gen Z generation the way that it might be to other people. And they're just looking at this as like, it's all a mess, not surprising. I do think that, it being, for better or worse, I don't know how much people are paying attention really to the stories. I mean, you look at people who watch the news, it's not younger vote. It's actually a very small percentage of the population, and it's not young voters. They're getting it from social media. I do think conversations about it online help to make it front of mind for people, but I really think that it's about the issues for young people. Yes. Won't work.
I was going to say, how important, I remember on TV and affecting me when I was, but how important are the musicians now? I mean, I was just hearing in the last 24 hours, Beyonce is probably going to lend her music, and Charlie, and the whole Charlie XCX thing, and I have a 17-year-old son who actually is talking to me about it. So how important are those to getting the young people? Because they may not pay attention to half the things, but the minute, a Taylor Swift or somebody lends their hand, so what do you guys do in storytelling with these high profile people? Because I feel like, I imagine in storytelling, that's a huge.
Yeah, we also work with all the influencers and celebrities and musicians. A lot of times so quite honestly, in a presidential year, a lot of times the campaign takes them and we can't work with them because now they've endorsed, quite frankly. I do think that we're tapping even more into, we know the Beyoncés, the John Legends, they're going to always lend a hand and a voice in this. I don't know that there's anyone in their networks who are not yet activated. I would be shocked. So I think it's actually about the lesser known artists who have very loyal followings and who don't necessarily always weigh into this. So in 2020, Snoop Dogg, he's, for folks who don't know, that was the first time he voted. He actually thought he couldn't vote as with a conviction, right? And so he did a piece on basically rights restoration and the fact he could vote. That's another storytelling. So just examples, yeah.
Thanks for doing this, by the way. I know your week has been insane. And also good to know I'm officially old. But I'd be curious, I think you've got a really unique POV, Carolyn, on reaching this very young demo, which a lot of us have talked about this week. I'd be curious if you've got any lessons maybe from the work you guys have done, or tips for brands, other people who may be in the room, for reaching that, what you're calling young generation, maybe in a way that we're not thinking about.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I think, I'm an elder millennial, right? Like we have our team's amazing, but we have a lot of team members who are Gen Z, so I run a lot of things by them. So I do think that Gen Z needs to be at the table. So if you don't have someone if you want to reach that audience, but you don't have someone on your team, right, or a focus group or something, that's going to be a challenge. I rely on them a lot, and I let them know I'm very grateful. And they have a voice, right, in the decisions that we make. It's not always, I'm not going to agree with them 100%, but I'm always shocked. I'll even look at a campaign or an idea, and I'll be like, ugh. But then I'll share it with them, and I'll get notes back, and it actually helps me understand how they're thinking about it. And I'm like, oh, okay, like I can see where you're coming from. And so, I think actually what's the hardest thing is to get brands to embrace an edgier campaign or an edgier, thing. I think that's the hard thing. And I think that's going to be a challenge. That's a larger challenge. That's like, that's why I'm like, I feel like we need to do this in a democracy space, because it's going to have to be a power in numbers, right? You can't have one. It's going to be real hard and we saw that over the last 8 years. It's hard for one company to go out there on its own. But when you have several companies going out there together on something, it's much harder to break them down. Yes.
Do you have a formal process for identifying the issues that resonate most with your identified audience?
Yeah, there are several polls that happen. There's some great institutes with the universities, so like Kennedy School IOP focuses on young people. Circle out of Tufts focuses on young people. So there's a lot of good data. There didn't used to be, so we used to actually have to fund the research ourselves, but less so these days.
And the second part of the question is there a differential, you talked about being nonpartisan. Mm-hmm. Do you find that the younger audience that you're talking to is nonpartisan, or obviously there's partisans within the audience, but do you find yourself challenged with staying nonpartisan in this environment?
I would say that what has become difficult is every issue has become what's called a wedge issue in our space. And wedge issues you are supposed to stay away from. We have a history since our first campaign, Censorship is Un-American, which some of you may remember. of leaning into the issues, even if they were controversial issues, which provides us cover. I do think this is where, honestly, if you asked a lot of Gen Zers, they would say this isn't a party thing, right? We actually don't like the parties. This is all about the issues. And so from that perspective, that's really, really where we align is for the youth generation, all the data really says it's not about, you might get a great candidate that resonate with young people, as we saw, in 2008 with Obama, but you don't get those. And so it really does come down to the issues, so we have to talk about them. There are ways to talk about the issues that are what we consider higher risk or lower risk, right? You can say, if you care about reproductive rights, vote. We're not telling you vote for, right? So there are ways to highlight it too. Yes.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. It really helps a lot of people. And actually, the last question, you kind of partly answered it. But I'm curious about, in this information environment, that you see a lot of situations. I was really interested when you talked about the nonpartisan line and even dealing with the concept of democracy itself teetering. And it seems like from all sides, there are people who have concepts about even what reality is, much less the information that they get. Are you seeing a lot of them talking about how they're dealing with what is like media literacy issues?
So that's one of the topics that would be on this version. You're not, yes, media literacy is a huge, right? Misinformation, disinformation, malinformation is a huge issue that we are only going to see become a greater issue with AI, because it's much easier now to create and to spread. I do think this is where the youth generation, because they've grown up with social media, that they actually have a better idea of what's real and what's not. I'm not saying that they don't, right, missource things or they believe everything, everything that they believe is true. But I do think that they have more of a comfort level with an understanding of how the technology works. So there's like some healthy skepticism, right, of what's out there. But you're absolutely right, that's a topic we need to address. And that's the type of topic, right, that doesn't have to happen the 3 months before an election, and shouldn't. Yes.
Hi, I'm in the political ad space and I have a young voter, first-time voter in my family.
Yay.
Are there some brands that maybe are less called for as partners that maybe have already come out on the issue in a way that is perceived to be more partisan, or you feel like maybe the brands are using this campaign to reach this demographic without authentically?
So yeah, I think I hear what you're saying. I'll try and, so it's not lost on me that when brands partner with us, it's like an altruistic, right? Like, and actually also to what you were saying earlier is we've seen, so pre-2016, the trend was there were some brands that were willing to do the work, but a lot of them said voting's too political. We can't touch it, which, folks, we're in a democracy. If, like, that's the requirement, right? Like, I don't know how you, like, if you only have, and a lot of times when I'm speaking in a space where I might be talking to a wide range of political views, I'll start with that base of, we have a republic, we have a democracy, and by definition, that means participation. If you only have a certain percentage of the population voting, that's not a democracy, right? You're talking about an oligarchy, you're talking about a different form of government. So it is on us, it's a responsibility to be promoting voting, and this is where, quite honestly, the government's not doing a good job In many cases, it is purposely designed that way, right? And they're not funding election official. And I could go through the list of all the things that are wrong, right? That we can't fix in the next 3 months, but maybe over time, if we're putting our heads together, we can try and fix. But in terms of like, is there a brand, I would say there are better ways to do it, and there are less, if you're doing it at all, that's a good thing. I think, there are some brands we work with that don't want to do something public, but want to just do something for their employees. Or they want to test it out with their employees, and then maybe next cycle they'll do something public. The other thing I didn't mention is sometimes the challenge with brands is they come in thinking, we're going to register 1 million voters, because they think about their commercial metrics and their ROIs, and I have to be the one to be like, I don't want to kill the partnership. I want to be like, we need to bring that goal down quite a bit.
1 million views,
Yeah.
1 million visits. It's always a million for some reason. That's the benchmark.
And I'm not going to say who, but someone came in 2020 and was like, we're going to do 1 million registrations. And I got them to at least 250, and they did 40,000. And that was a lot. Yeah. Like, that is a lot for our space. So I also think, like, one of the things is when you're doing this work you have to come with some authenticity, because the number is not going to make you happy. Like, that's the reality.
But if you think about how many, some states, 40,000 vote, I mean, that's the difference.
40,000 votes decided the 2020 election.
Yeah.
So, yep. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Yes. Can we talk about it?
I
don't
think
know
we're
that we can talk
we're in development on that right now. We should be able to talk about it in a couple of weeks, but yeah.
Yeah.
We have a
And
Someone lean on the lights there.
no video cameras. We're engaging some of our brands specifically for the reproductive rights conversation. So it's a little bit of a, again, sensitive subject, but we have some brands that are, I think, willing to take that on in a more, I think, bipartisan way. And so we're excited to launch that hopefully in the next 2 to 4 weeks.